So let's go back to the flex here, and this is where data binding is going to come in place. So I'll go ahead and talk to you exactly what I plan on doing. So the slider here, you saw how I moved it back and forth before, and the values of the slider changes either from negative 100 to 100 depending on where I'm at. So what I want to do is to showcase data binding and how powerful it is within Flex, in that so if we have an application that we're working on and this slider will change the rate for maybe a bank application, and we want that rate to also be visible as a number somewhere else on the screen. Before, maybe with AS3 and not Flex, we would have the scroll bar and get its value, and through either an event of dragging this slider or letting go of the mouse, we would have this text box which would be displaying the value. We'd have to programmatically wire that up and say, when this guy is let go, change this value. And that's okay if we have a few components on the page doing that. But if we have a really big application where on this screen we slide the scroll bar and this value changes, but that value also need to be changed on like the fifth screen of the application, we don't want to have to programmatically change that one by one in the back end. We want Flex to be able to bind all these values by itself just with the power of data binding. So this is going to be a really helpful little tutorial, and this quick example will showcase this here in a second. So since we have IDs on our slider, we can use this ID as a reference to get its attributes with other components. So I'm going to take H slider here, and inside this text input, currently when you first open the application it's empty. But what we wanted to do is, if we go inside of this text attribute here, normally we could type in a string, and that would always be static unless we change it in the back end somewhere. But if we want this text input to always have the value of the slider, we can do that through data binding. And instead of typing in a string right there, what we have to do is we use the curly brackets, and these are the syntax for data binding within Flex. It's pretty simple. Instead of the double strings, we go ahead and just put the curly braces, and anything that's in here is going to be the code that we will need. So like I was saying, we need to take the value of H slider. So if I take this, make a reference of that guy, and within Flex, if I go ahead and just do the dot notation, it'll drop down and allow me to choose the value that I want, or the attribute. And I want the slider's value. So what this means is, whatever the value is of this slider, depending on, even when I scroll it or change it, however it is, its value is going to be displayed within the text input that we have here. And that's essentially what data binding is that changing something here will essentially change anything that's bound to it throughout the application at the same time, and we don't have to do anything about it. It's all done in the back end. So let's go ahead here and take a quick look, and we'll run this. You'll see that we have our slider here is at 0, and conveniently this is at 0 as well, because when this was created, this at the next line then took its bound value and it put it in here. So to showcase binding, when I click and scroll this, our text input will change the same way that our value of our slider is changing. So you can see the tooltip show up for the slider at 5960, and down here at the bottom at the scroll it's 5960 with a whole bunch of other decimal points, but essentially it's exactly the same thing, and it's taking the value, and this thing is just truncated a little bit. So negative 100, and then 2.46, and then 100. So you can see how this, whatever I change here at the slider, will change this as well. So right now I took everything out of the input, and so it's still picking up its text as what we just changed. So it's empty right now, but as soon as I change it again, it's going to bind that value to within that text input. Let's go back to the Flex real quick and kind of discuss this a little bit more. So like I said, if I change the value of the H slider, this guy will change as well. So just real quickly, I'm going to put in a button, just a normal button, and we'll label reset slider, so that when we click on this button, we want the H slider value to be reset to 0, so it will return back to its middle point. And when we do that, if I go ahead and run it, so when we do that, we have the slider here. This is the button. I have the reset slider button. So what the plan is when our slider is over anywhere like at 80 or so, and we want to reset it. When we reset the slider, we're not touching this text input at all, but because it's bound again to this slider, it'll automatically go to 0 as well because the slider was set to that. And you see how that changed, and this changed as well. And we did no code saying programmatically in the background to do this other than the binding. So basically this is our data binding example, and it showcases just how powerful data binding in Flex is. This is really a generic and pretty basic example. I hope to go into further detail down the road with more examples, but this is a really good start of how powerful data binding is within Flex. Thank you.